There we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about cross-section annotation, and I've got quite a bit of information here to share. So let's just go dive right into it. So the topics I'm going to cover is just an overview of the process and some of the background things that need to be defined for the cross-section annotation. And then we'll cover some of the annotation options that Bentley offers for our grid and our cross sections, for individual point annotations, segment annotations, and then I want to wrap it up with customizing your own annotation group. So the ODOT annotations are tended to be pretty generic and address a lot of scenarios, but it's not going to address everything, and you may have to make some customizations. So just as an overview of the process, the cross-section annotations are placed in the drawing model for each cross-section, and that includes a grid for the cross-section. So there's just an example there of a typical cross-section in the drawing model. So what can be annotated? Well, I mentioned those. Bentley provides 4 types of annotations, actually. So the grid, linear annotations or segments, point annotations, and the last one is a frame annotation, which we're not using for any of the ODOT stuff, so I'm not going to cover that. So the annotations are defined in the Ohio DOT feature definitions, DGN Lib, and it looks like I've got a problem there on my slide as in my dialogues over top of the text, but each annotation is defined as a separate annotation definition, and then those definitions are put together in a group. So looking at the microstation Explorer dialog, our open road standards, and then looking just at the library here. So starting from the bottom up is the individual annotation definitions, and then those definitions are grouped together in an annotation group, and then there's 2 different annotation groups in ODOT standards currently. That's odd. I wonder why that reset those. I had that. So I'll fix the PowerPoint before we distribute that. So the annotation group is selected when you're generating the sheets. So this is in the sheet clipping process. When I get to the create drawing dialog, it's going to default to the appropriate annotation group for the sheet scale that you're placing, but that's where that is selected when you initially process. So then when the sheets are generated, that annotation group and all the definitions are copied into your container file. And once that's been copied into your container file, those definitions can be edited in that container file. And then after you make edits in each drawing model, you'll have to use the model annotation commands to remove those annotations and then to re-annotate that model. So some background stuff that you need. Annotations use 2 different things. They use element templates and they use text favorites. So the element templates are used to define the symbology, and then the text favorites are used to compute values, such as the elevation of a point or the slope of a segment. So a lot of users have never had to really work directly with element templates or text favorites. So I want to start just kind of giving a little background information here on those items. So what I've got open here is my container file, and I've already clipped some sheets, and so that the information has been copied into the container file. So if I go to the place text command, there's an insert favorite option here, and that's a text favorite. So that list is just the text favorites that are configured in the ODOT workspace. And if I get onto the bottom, I see some cross-section text favorites. So there's text favorites there for in the area and cut volumes and things like that. Then there's some ones for like our point offset, our point elevation, the slope of a line, or the station. So these text favorites have already been configured. If I pick the manage button, that's where I can create new text favorites. So it's going to show me the library and those text favorites that were in that list, and I can't edit those, but what I can do is in my file, I can create a new favorite and then give it a name. And then over towards the right is where I'm going to define the text style and stuff for that text favorite. So the field type, one of the field types is open roads cross-section fields, and then that sets the subtype to cross-section annotations. So here's just the different types of things that can be annotated, or at least extract values for a text favorite from a cross-section. So just looking at the point, I can extract any of these pieces of information for the point. Once I've selected that on the right, I can set, my number decimal places and things like that, and then just accept that, and it adds it to that text favorite. So then I can just save that, and that's now a text favorite that's available in this file. So if there's something that you need added to the standards, that's something that you could just contact ODOT through their support request. So I'm going to go ahead and close this and not save that. So that's just a quick overview of a text favorite and how one is configured. The second thing that's used in our annotation is an element template. So on the attributes group on the home tab is the element templates. And again, these are all read from ODOT's library. So if I go in and manage these, I can see the element templates that are coming from the library or any that might be in the active file. So what I'm going to do is just expand the feature definitions DGN Lib, and there's a group for annotations here. And under annotations, there's sheets, and then there's XS for cross sections. So these are element templates for various things that would get labeled in a cross section. So for example, the XS_text element template is set to the sheet text level, and then by level for the color, style, and weight. It's a primary class element, no transparency, and a priority of 500. So the element templates just define symbology. In my video, I should have clicked on the XS quantity table, because that one is an example of something that places a cell. So it just adds the cell name to that definition for that element template. So that's just a little background on the text favorites and element templates. So if I'm going to edit an annotation definition after I've processed it, what I need to do in Explorer is just right click on that annotation group name, and then I can choose the manage option to edit that. So here's a video. We're going to just go ahead and manage this text favorite and just kind of talk about the dialogue. So I'm in my container file here, and I've got my Explorer dialog open, and I have the 5-scale XS annotation group selected, and I did hit play, so I must be talking about something in the video there. All right, so in our active file under annotation groups, there's that 5-scale XS annotation that was copied in, and I can right click on that and pick manage. It also is available in the properties dialog. There's the annotation list, and it says it varies. If I click in there, I get a little button that'll let me manage that. So here's the dialog for the managing the annotations. And on the left is all the different annotation definitions that are in that particular. And those were created by adding new, and there's those 4 types. And you can also use ones that have already been defined. So if I say add existing, these are individual annotation definitions that are in the ODOT library. So there's commands across the top there to delete one, copy and paste one, move it up or down in the list, import it from an XML file, or export it to an XML file. There's also a button to select the template that you're going to be working with for defining your annotations, and it's going to show that over there in the right. So I'm just going to pick a template out of the template library, and then if I think I do the fit command here, it's going to display that. So you've got commands across the top right for the view. You can turn off the display of that template. Sometimes when you're working with the annotations and you click on them, it's a little slower if it has to update the display, so turning that off can be useful. So there's a fit, and it's just showing me that template. There's a window command. It's a little different. These aren't microstation commands. I have to drag through it for that to work. There's fit or zoom commands. The pan left and pan right kind of work different from what I expect. I hit pan left and the section's moving to the right. What I'm viewing is to the right or left, and then up or down, just pan up, and pan down moves it up or down. So those are a little inconsistent in how they're defined. Then the last two, there's a hide selected. So whatever I have selected is displayed, and most of the annotations are displayed. It doesn't show a lot of the, well, I'll just leave it at that. So the PGL is placed at the bottom, and if I can zoom in or out with the commands or use the mouse wheel. If I highlight, it does refit that, but if I zoom back in, you can see the current annotation definition is highlighted for the PGL. The value that's shown there is just a placeholder. It's going to be read from the text favorite. It's going to go read the elevation of that PGL point in the cross section. So this is just kind of overview of the dialog. So from here, we'll kind of go into some of these and talk about how they're configured. So I'm going to start with the grid annotation. And this is defined in our ODOT standards for a typical cross-section grid. The grid includes the station annotation and the offsets across the bottom and elevation labels on the right. And this is something you probably won't need to edit. So here's a little video that talks a bit about the grid. So this is in that Manage Annotations dialog. And if I'm creating one from scratch, I would use the Add button up here to add that in. And I would select the grid annotation option. So in the ODOT stuff, it's named 5-scale excess sheet annotation, and it matches the name of the annotation group. So the grid itself has several parameters that can be defined, and I'm going to highlight that so we can see, everything that's controlled by the grid. So I mentioned it's the grid lines, it's the station value, and the elevations across the bottom. And if I scroll over to the right, that's the offsets across the bottom and the elevations on the side. And again, the values here are just placeholders. It doesn't matter. So I'm not going to go through all the parameters here, but the bottom is turned on, the top's turned on, and then there's a horizontal template. That's a MicroStation element template. So it's using the excess sheet grid element template for that. And if I come down and look at a couple of these, going down to the horizontal axis title, that's the one that's going to control the station label. So you can see in that horizontal axis title group, it's set to draw is true and the angle is 0. And there it's using the text favorite of the XS station for that annotation. So that's how that's defined. It's using a center justification for that, and it's using that XS text element template to control the level, style, and weight of that. So that's all I really want to talk about with the grid. Like I said, you probably will not need to edit the grid. So let's move on and talk about our point annotations. So point annotations are defined by either a point name or by a feature definition. And points can be annotated with either text or a cell. And the text annotations use those text favorites to compute the values, such as a station, offset, elevation, point name, or feature. So this is just zoomed in on the bottom again, the XGL and PGL elevation annotations. And as I said, the station is annotated with the grid. So we've run into a couple of user support issues with this. So I want to talk about this a little bit. The PGL elevation does require a point named PGL in the template. So it's going to find that point at my cross section. Actually, it's a 3D line string generated from that point, and it's going to annotate it using the excess point elevation annotation. So we had a consultant working on a project where the project was just shoulders and side slopes. They didn't actually have a PGL, so they didn't have a PGL point in their cross section, so they weren't getting that annotated. But the PGL point also triggers the earthwork table, and they weren't getting an earthwork table. So I'm going to talk about that a little more in another slide. So that's something to be aware of, is that PGL point does trigger the earthwork table, that placement of that cell, and there's another option for that. The XGL annotation does require a point named XGL in the template. So again, we've had some people, that's just a null point in the ODOT templates, and we've had some people delete that, and then they don't get the existing elevations. And that's why you need to have that point in your template in order to get those existing elevations. So again, my text got reset somehow behind my dialogues. I'll fix that in the PowerPoint for distribution. But that XGL and PGL annotation does have to have a feature definition defined. So we did have a support request where the user had the PGL and XGL in the template, but it was defined with the feature definition was set to none, and it wasn't picking that up. So it does need to have the feature definition. And this is the point properties dialog in the template creation is where this is. So make sure you've got the feature definition assigned for that. Okay, so I'm going to skip through this video here. This one's going to talk about some of the parameters for our PGL, and it applies to the XGL as well. So that's been defined again in the ODOT annotation group, and that was defined as a point annotation. So I'm not sure what I'm talking about here in the video. Here we go. So it was added as a point annotation, and then once that's added, you can define the point using the location information here. So if I put my focus in that field, there's a box I can click on that's going to open the dialog that I can manage this annotation filter. So when I'm working with points, I can tell it, hey, let's just use all the points in the template that the cross-section intersections, or I can just filter this by a list of points, and that's what the PGL and XGL are defined as, just to do a list of points. So that's at the very bottom, and I can use that select points from template to choose my template, and it's going to show me the template, and it's going to show me anything that's annotated there on the right, and then a list of all the points on the left. They're highlighting those in white. If I remove it from the list, you can see it's just shown as red. So I'll do a fit on this, and I can click on the points, and it will add those to the list. So you can see I picked on a point for the left tie, and multiple points were highlighted. And that's because in the template definition, those have a feature name override assigned of left tie. And in the point list, those are shown in red. So anything that has a feature name override will have red text in the point list. So I'm going to remove that one, and let's go back and just put the PGL back in here. And then I'll just close this dialog. So that's how that's defined. There are some different expressions that can be used. In this particular one, we're not using any. I am going to talk about those a little bit in another video. So once I have my point defined that I'm annotating, I can annotate it with either text or a cell, and then I'm going to choose the template that is going to be used for that. So this one's annotated with text. We're not placing a leader line, so I just turn that off, close that up. The PGL is going to be placed 0.75 units from the bottom border. So that's what controls the vertical location of that. So I turned on highlight, and we can see it in yellow. The horizontal location, it's going to be controlled by the location of the point itself, wherever the cross-section intersects that point. So in this case, my PGL was right at the center line, so it's right at the 0 offset. Okay, we're not placing a cell, so I'm going to collapse that. There's where that prefix is defined for a PGL space, and there's my style is the label center style, and it's using that XS point elevation text favorite to compute the elevation value. So that's an example of annotating a single point, and we go ahead and move on to our next slide. So ditch elevations are also another single point annotation, and I want to mention this. In the template library a while back, Matt and JD made some changes to the names of the points, and they're now using L-ditch inside and R-ditch inside for that inside point on the ditches. So some of the older templates used just L-ditch and R-ditch. And the annotation definition has been updated with these new names, but in my case, I'm running a template that was created with the L-ditch, R-ditch, or well, maybe I think it was the ditch inside outside, but my annotation definition is an older annotation definition. So here's how you can take care of that if you run into this situation. So what I've got here is just a cross section. You can see I don't have any ditch annotations, and that point there is R-ditch inside. So what I want to do is go back to my container file and make an edit to my annotation definition to include that point name. So here's the container file, and in the container file, I'm going to browse through the standards of the local file, annotation groups, cross-section drawing, and there's my annotation group. We'll right-click to manage that. So this is going to be my ditch annotation right, and you can see the location. It says on top. Let's take a look at that. So I'm using a list of points, and I am using an expression of on top and a point named r-ditch. So I can select that from the templates. And again, this is an older annotation definition. It didn't have the r-ditch-inside. So I'm just going to pick that from the list and add it to the points that will be annotated, and just apply that expression change and close the dialog. Not going to make any other changes. Just go ahead and close that out and go back to my cross section. In my cross section model, I'm in the Open Roads Modeling tab, Drawing Production, and I'm going to remove the model annotations. I could do this for all the models or just this model, and then I'm going to re-annotate that. And then you'll see I'll have my ditch annotation for that right ditch inside point when this re-annotates. So it's justified by the top left, and that's going to be directly below that ditch inside. And I can see the offset, and it might be something I want to tighten up a bit. If I want to tighten up that offset, I can just go back to my annotation definition and change that vertical offset value. Okay, so I think that's about everything in this video, so let's move forward. I mentioned the earthwork table. The PGL point is what triggers that earthwork table placement. And I mentioned a project where they did not have a PGL and they weren't getting the earthwork table. So what we did is add it to the annotation group, and if it finds a point named EW_table, it'll place this cell in the template. The location of the point really doesn't matter. It's just, is it there? Yes. It places the table in the upper right. So it's using the border top and the border right for the placement of that cell. So that's something to be aware of with an earthwork table. You can just add a null point named EW_table, and it will trigger the placement of that. Right away, there's been various seminars where we've talked about right away, so I'm not going to go too deep in this, but the right away annotations use the feature definition. So what I've got here is just an example of one of them. So the expression, it's using a conditional expression. So it's looking at all the points, and it says if the point feature definition equals this right away proposed aerial easement, then it's going to annotate that, and then those annotation definitions are set up with a cell. So there's some information in webinar 12 on open topics. There's other, we've covered right-of-way in a couple of different sessions. So I'm just going to leave it at that for right-of-way annotations. So let's talk about segments and annotating the slope. So our ODOT annotation definition looks at a pair of points on top of the cross section to annotate the slope. And the points are defined generically. They're not hard-coded by the point name. And there's a statement in there, the segment must be greater than 2.9 feet, or actually not less than 2.9. It's kind of a little odd logic, but if it's less than 2.9, it's not going to be annotated. There's a reason for that, and I'll talk about that here as we take a look at this video. So again, here's some slope examples. So if it's less than 10%, it's going to label it with a percent. If it's greater than 10%, it's going to label it with a ratio. And that's defined in the text favorite itself. And I can see I didn't get one on my back slope over there. I don't have any annotations for the shoulders. There's one for the left lane, but not the right lane. That's actually a known problem in the 10.9 release. It sometimes misses a segment, so that's been logged with Bentley. And I'll talk about the shoulders here in a minute. Then I can see on the left side, I did get an annotation on the back slope, but I didn't have an annotation on the back slope on the right. So what I want to do is look at my annotation group, and let's go manage that. and take a look at the slope definition. So it's in the ODOT stuff, it just is slope, and that was added originally as a linear annotation, and then parameters were set for that. And I'll look at the location values for this. So we are using some, we're looking at all the segments, and it could also be defined to create a list of segments, and I'll show you that in the last video I've got. And it is using some expressions here. So there's 3 expressions. So it's saying, hey, 0.1 on top and 0.2 on top. So those are generic. They're not using point names. And that's just coming from this list. It says click or drag to add an expression. So you just click on 0.1 on top, and then I think you have to double click actually. And then that and logical operator, and then 0.2 on top is how that is built. So that's the first condition, 0.1 and 0.2 on top, and it's not less than 2.9 feet. So why 2.9 feet? So the idea behind that was on a shoulder in the ODOT template library, the shoulders have an intermediate point in the middle that's used for the break on super elevation. And that shoulder break is typically 2 feet or 2.5 feet, depending on your shoulder width. So the idea was not to annotate that shoulder as 2 separate segments, and it doesn't get annotated at all on a 4-foot shoulder. So 2.9 was used. If it's greater than that, then it's going to. So I'm going to just remove this. Now, historically, on older plans, you wouldn't annotate pavement slopes at all. So it kind of doesn't need to be there. The other condition is 0.1 elevation does not equal 0.2 elevation. That would be our ditch. So we don't want to annotate a slope on anything that's flat. All right, so I've made changes there. I'm going to come back and just remove my model annotations, and then re-annotate the model. And we'll see popping in on my shoulder are those 2 annotations based on that shoulder breakpoint that's defined in the middle. So there's a couple ways you could, if you're going to show this slope, you could just delete one of them. Sorry, it's a manual process. It had to be done in every section, and then you can move that one over. Another option would be to, if you don't have super elevation, go back to your template, delete that point out of the template, and you'd have to reconstrain your outside shoulder point, and then reprocess your model, and then you won't have that point in the middle. So I've got the same thing on the other side. And here you can see I now have that back slope annotated that was missing before, and that's because the segment length was less than 2.9, and that's why that wasn't annotated before. So just some things to look out for on the slope annotation, and why you may not get some pieces and some edits you can make there to adjust that. Now you can create your own annotation group, and this allows you to control exactly what's annotated, and this will be created in the container file. And you can reuse some ODOT annotation definitions that are already available. So here's a video that's going to talk about creating a custom annotation group. So I've already processed the sections, and that annotation group has been copied into the active file. So one thing I could do is copy the ODOT one and edit it, or I could create a new one and just give it a name. So we'll name this my excess annotation, and we'll manage the new one. So I've got no definitions at all included. So I can add new definitions, or I can use some out of the ODOT library. To do that, let's try that again. I'll just expand this, and there's all the available annotation definitions that are in the ODOT library. So I'm going to annotate the PGL, so I'll just use that. I'm going to annotate the XGL. I probably bring in the grid next. So there's that excess scale, 5-scale excess sheet annotation. That's our gridded area. And I bring in a couple more. Trying to remember what I do. Oh, if I want that earthwork table, I can bring in quantity table, or the quantity table using the EW_table point. So I can bring one of those in if I want that. Click on it. And I'm also showing here that if you have right-of-way, you don't need to include all of these. You could just go select only the ones that are applicable to your particular project. So you don't need to have all of those right-of-way items. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new linear annotation here. So I can define my slope annotation for the segments that I want to be annotated. So I'll just give it a name. I called it linear slopes. And in location, I'll click the little button here. I actually want to pick my template before I go define that. So I'm going to just use that same template that I used earlier and OK that. So now let's go ahead and define this annotation filter. So instead of using all segments, I'm going to create a list of segments. And once I select that option at the bottom, I've got the area where I'm going to select those segments from the template. So let's go ahead and pick that, and it's going to show me my template. And I should be able to use this button to select those graphically. And I've noticed when I did this, I got that. So I've not talked to Bentley yet. I don't know if that's just my data or if there's a problem there. So instead of selecting it, there's a list here of point 1 and point 2. And it's tedious a bit, but I can scroll through that list to select the appropriate things. Well, if I remember right, those were using point name overrides, so they're highlighted in red. So I'm coming down to the bottom and I'm seeing those listed here, and that's mostly the ones I'm going to want to annotate. So just going to pick them from the list and add them to the list. And as I add them, you'll see them highlighted. There's my outside shoulder to my graded shoulder. Here's ditch inside to ditch outside. I'm not going to annotate a slope on that. That's my ditch. And here's the ditch outside to the tie. So I'm just going through and picking these. So again, it's a bit tedious based on the point names. And I will talk to Bentley about that exception I got when I graphically selected the point and see what I get back from them. Again, I'm actually running in 2020 release 3. So it's a 10.9 version. I'm running that version for all these videos and using the current ODOT standards. So earlier when we talked about compatibility with standards, if you're ahead of ODOT, that's okay. If you're behind, then you'll probably run into problems. Okay, for the slopes, I'm going to annotate it with text, and I'm going to pick an element template for that. So the element template is going to control the level, color, style, and weight of that text. So we'll use just that XS text element template. I'm not going to place any dimension lines with that. For my placement of the slope, I don't want an absolute angle. I want it to be tangent to the element that it's annotating. And I'm not going to set a vertical offset. I'm going to use a text style. I'm not placing a cell, so I'll collapse that. I'm going to use a text style that has built into it a bit of an offset. So there's this label center descender. That's something that's new in Connect as a justification as a center descender. And that gives it an offset built into it. So I don't need to set an offset value. So for the slopes, we're going to use a text favorite of our XS slope. And again, these are coming from the ODOT library or any that you have defined in your container file. And we're not going to do any view rotation. So I'm going to go ahead and close this and go back and annotate my cross section. So I'm back on my cross section. So I'm going to remove my annotations and we'll go ahead and annotate this. And you're going to see when I was picking my segments, I did not pick any pavement or shoulder segments. So I'm annotating using my XS annotation. And I didn't include a ditch, so I don't have ditches. But you see, I didn't include pavement or shoulders, so I don't have those annotations. And like I said, historically, we wouldn't annotate pavement slopes anyway. So that may be desirable, and then you don't have to worry about cleaning up any of those shoulder annotations. So that's the process to create your own group, to pick the segments that you want to annotate. And I know some users that like to do it that way and just go that and create their own. So a couple of known issues. 2020 release 2 update 8. I ran into removing model annotations, and re-annotating doesn't always function. Sometimes it generates an exception log and doesn't complete the task. So I've run into that and we've logged it. It was confirmed by Bentley. As I said, I'm running 2020 release 3 update 9, and you can see I was removing and re-annotating with no problems. So that's apparently been resolved with update 3. And then in update 3, occasionally some of the segments don't get annotated. We've seen that, and we've had a couple reports of that from a couple consultants, and that's been logged with Bentley. So a couple things to be aware of. So that's everything I've got to cover here. I see there's a couple questions. How would you export the annotation group so that you could use it in another file in the same project or another project? As soon as I run sections, that annotation group copied to my container file. What you can do, I don't have ORD open, so I'm not going to go live. What you can do is you can right click on an annotation group from the OHDOT feature definition library and pick copy, and then you can go down to the feature definition list for your file under the annotation groups and go in there and paste it in. So you can copy and paste from the ODOT standard before you even process it, and then you could make adjustment or changes to the copy before you've actually processed. I don't know if that exactly answers the question, but that's an option. Then someone else said they've had the same issue selecting segments using that plus sign with that exception I got. So I'll submit that to Bentley. I suspect it's already been logged by someone else. So that's all I've got. If you guys have any questions, you can throw them in the chat, or of course you can use ODOT's support request stuff